By the billionaire storm outside began to clear, his voice cutting through the relentless storm. His words echoed over the howling winds and the torrential downpour of a chaotic, unforgiving day. He was en route to seal a billion-dollar deal, a moment he had been preparing for when, boom, suddenly, his car swerved off the road. One of the tires had blown out. With no phone signal and no sign of help, everything felt like it was slipping away. But then, out of nowhere, 3 teenage boys appeared, laughing and chatting as they biked toward him. "Need some help, sir?" one of them asked, his voice cutting through the storm's fury. In just 20 minutes, the flat tire was replaced and the billionaire was back on his way. Grateful, he reached into his wallet to offer money, but the boys refused. A few days later, something unexpected arrived at their door, a black SUV with special gifts for the boys. Let's reflect on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The rain came down in sheets, unrelenting, as Chris, a self-made billionaire, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes. The storm had turned everything against him. Raindrops hammered the roof of his car, sounding like a drumbeat with each drop, reminding him that his tight schedule was quickly slipping away. The windshield wipers were working overtime, furiously trying to clear his view of the winding, empty road. Chris glanced at the clock, just 45 minutes until his critical meeting in the city. A billion-dollar deal. This wasn't just any meeting. It could define his career. Chris, the ever-precise businessman, had always prided himself on control. But that control started to slip away when suddenly, boom, his car jerked violently to the side. The unmistakable thud of a flat tire rang out. "Damn it," he cursed, pulling the car over to the narrow shoulder of the road. He stepped out into the downpour, grimacing as the cold rain soaked through his expensive tailored suit. The wind howled around him, and the muddy roadside squelched under his polished shoes. He opened the trunk to see the spare tire and a jack, but panic began to settle in. Changing a tire wasn't exactly in his skill set. That was for the staff, not him. He was out in the middle of nowhere, standing in a small, deserted stretch of road, surrounded only by the rain, vast fields, and the ticking clock. His frustration grew as he reached for his phone, only to realize he had no signal. "God damn it," he muttered, scanning the barren landscape. The road stretched on endlessly in both directions, and he felt completely alone. If he didn't make it to the meeting, not only would he lose the deal, but his reputation as a punctual, professional billionaire would take a huge hit. He was just about to give up when, suddenly, he heard faint laughter cutting through the storm. Squinting, he saw 3 figures on bicycles, laughing and chatting as they pedaled toward him. The boys, no older than 15, had a carefree spirit despite the torrential rain. Their mismatched raincoats were covered in mud from the puddles they'd ridden through. As they neared his car, the tallest boy, dressed in a worn blue raincoat, called out, "Hey, mister, need some help?" Chris straightened, blinking in disbelief. He glanced at their bikes, then back at their young faces. Instinctively, he was about to decline, but reality quickly set in. Yeah, I got a flat tire," he finally admitted, gesturing toward the shredded rubber. "But I'm not sure you can help." The boy in the blue coat, Ethan, interrupted with a confident grin. "We've done this loads of times," he said, handing his bike off to his friend Tony. "Well, mostly on bikes, but it's the same idea." Chris hesitated, watching the boys exchange glances. Ethan knelt down to inspect the tire, and his friends began grabbing tools from the trunk. "You got a spare, right?" Ethan asked, peering up through his rain-spattered glasses. "In the trunk," Chris replied, stepping aside. What happened next was nothing short of impressive. The boys worked in perfect harmony. Tony grabbed the jack, Peter steadied the car, and Ethan, the leader, began loosening the lug nuts with impressive precision. "You don't mind getting wet, do you?" Chris asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "It's just rain," Peter shrugged. "We're already soaked anyway." As they worked, Chris couldn't help but admire their efficiency. Despite their soaked clothes and the storm's fury, they moved with the natural rhythm of people who knew exactly what they were doing. They laughed and chatted like they were on an adventure, not a chore. The tire was replaced in record time. Done. Ethan wiped his hands on his raincoat with a grin. Chris stood there, stunned. "You really pulled it off," he said, his voice filled with disbelief and gratitude. He reached into his wallet, pulling out some cash. "Here, take this, you've earned it." Ethan waved him off. "No need, mister. We were just passing by and thought we'd help." His friends nodded in agreement. "Besides," Tony added, "you need to get where you're going." Chris stared, confused. He wasn't used to such kindness without strings attached. "Are you sure?" he asked, holding the money out. Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "We're sure. Just drive safe, okay?" And with that, the three boys hopped back onto their bikes and rode off into the storm, their laughter echoing in the distance. Chris watched them disappear, standing there in silence. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name, something deeper than just gratitude. Back in his car, he glanced at the now-functioning dashboard clock. There was still time to make his meeting, but his mind was elsewhere. The boys had left a mark on him. Their kindness, their generosity, it had affected him more than he could have expected. The storm outside still raged, but now, Chris felt a new kind of urgency, a new sense of appreciation for the things that really mattered. The rain began to lighten as Chris arrived at the towering glass skyscraper. The valet rushed to greet him, holding an umbrella, but Chris barely noticed. His mind was still with the boys. As he walked into the conference room, his team was already there, preparing for the meeting. The clients, investors seated at the long mahogany table, gave him curious glances. Chris sat at the head of the table, forcing himself to focus. The billion-dollar merger, months in the making, was the most important deal of his career. As he presented his vision, answering questions with his usual precision, part of him kept drifting back to that moment with the boys, their laughter, their selflessness. It had affected him more than he wanted to admit. The meeting went on, and despite securing the deal, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't as fulfilling as he expected. As the clients left, congratulating him, Chris nodded absently, lost in thought. Back in his office, he sank into his leather chair and stared out at the rain-soaked city skyline. The storm outside seemed to echo his internal turmoil. Normally, he would have been celebrating the deal, basking in the rush of success. But today, his mind was elsewhere. He thought back to the boys, Ethan's confident smile, Tony's steady hands, Peter's casual shrug. They had shown him a selflessness he hadn't encountered in years. Their kindness had shaken something inside him, something he couldn't quite understand. He was going back to that small town, but not because he felt obligated. No, this time it was different. Chris knew that he had to do something more, something meaningful, to repay the boys for their kindness. He didn't know exactly what it would look like or how they would react, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of genuine purpose. It was something that went beyond billion-dollar deals and boardroom successes. It was something that truly mattered, something that was worth pursuing. The next morning, Chris woke up earlier than usual, the first rays of the sun peeking through the clouds, signaling the end of the storm. The remnants of the previous night's downpour lay scattered along the city streets in the form of puddles. Today, he dressed casually in a navy sweater and dark jeans, a stark departure from his usual suit and tie. Today wasn't about business, it was personal. As he drove toward the small town, the highway opened up to rolling fields and quiet houses. With each passing mile, the memory of the boys and their selfless act grew stronger in his mind. Chris realized that a simple gesture of thanks wouldn't be enough. He had to do something meaningful, something that would both show his gratitude and honor their humble nature. When he arrived at the stretch of road where the flat tire had halted him, the air felt fresh, the aftermath of the storm leaving a fragrant scent on the earth. He slowed his car as he neared the town, scanning the area for any sign of the boys. It didn't take long before he spotted them. Ethan, Tony, and Peter were outside a modest diner. Their bikes leaned against the wall. They were laughing, genuine, carefree laughter, the kind only youth and friendship can bring. Chris smiled and parked across the street. Stepping out of his car, He crossed the road, and Ethan noticed him first. "Hey, it's the guy from yesterday," he called out, nudging his friends. The other two looked up, their faces lighting up in recognition. "Hey, misters," Tony greeted, his tone casual but friendly. "Car holding up okay?"
Chris chuckled, nodding.
"Thanks to you three, it is." He paused for a moment, glancing at their bikes. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" The boys exchanged glances, then shrugged in unison. "Sure," Peter said, gesturing to the bench outside the diner. Chris sat down, feeling out of place, yet oddly at ease. "I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday," Chris said, his voice sincere. "You didn't have to help, but you did, and it made a bigger impact than you know." Ethan grinned. "It was no big deal. You looked like you needed a hand." Tony chimed in. "Yeah, and besides, we were already soaked. Figured we might as well do something useful." Chris laughed, shaking his head. "You three have more generosity than most people I've met in my entire life." Peter leaned back, crossing his arms. "It's just what you do, right? Help someone out when they need it." Chris studied them for a moment. Their sincerity caught him off guard once again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook he had brought with him to jot down ideas. "I know you didn't do it expecting anything in return," he began, "but I want to do something for you. For all of you." The boys looked at each other, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. "Like what?" Ethan asked, his tone measured. Chris leaned forward, his voice warm but serious. "How about I fix up your bikes, or get you something you've been wanting for a while? Something practical. Think of it as my way of showing appreciation." Tony frowned, shaking his head. "You don't have to do that, mister. We're good." Peter added, "Yeah, we weren't looking for a reward." Chris raised a hand, smiling. "I know, but this isn't about rewards. It's about paying forward the kindness you showed me. Let me do something for you." Ethan hesitated, glancing at his friends. "Well, there is something." Tony and Peter shot him curious looks, and Ethan continued, "There's this community center we hang out at sometimes. It's kind of falling apart, leaks in the roof, old equipment. They've been trying to raise money to fix it, but it's been slow going." Chris leaned back, considering this. "A community center, huh? That sounds like something worth helping with." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's where a lot of kids go after school. It's important to the town." Tony added, "If you really want to do something, maybe you could help them out instead of us." Chris smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. These boys weren't just kind. They were thoughtful. They cared about their community, even when they were being offered something for themselves. "All right," Chris said, standing up. "You've got a deal. I'll see what I can do about that community center." The boys grinned, their excitement tempered by humility. "Thanks, mister," Ethan said, extending his hand. Chris shook it firmly, looking at the trio with newfound respect. "No," Chris replied, his voice steady. "Thank you. You reminded me that the world could use more people like you." As Chris walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Helping the boys was just the beginning. This small town had something special, and Chris was determined to be a part of preserving it. As he drove away, the image of their smiling faces stayed with him, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples far beyond their origins. The next week, Chris returned to the small town, this time armed with a plan. He'd made a few calls, pulled some strings, things only someone with his resources could do. But this wasn't about flaunting his wealth. It was about using it for something that truly mattered. He parked near the diner where he'd first reconnected with the boys and stepped out, scanning the street. It was quieter today, the sleepy hum of a small town settling into its usual rhythm. Ethan, Tony, and Peter weren't at the diner, but Chris wasn't worried. He knew exactly where to find them. After chatting with a few locals, he made his way to the community center the boys had mentioned. The building was modest, its once bright paint now faded from years of wear and tear. The roof had visible patches, and the playground behind it looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Yet, there was a charm to it, a sense of purpose that shone through despite its imperfections. Inside, Chris found the boys sitting at a table covered in papers and markers. They were working on a banner that reads Community Center Fundraiser. Every little bit helps. When they saw him, their faces lit up with surprise. "Hey, Mr. Chris," Ethan greeted, setting down a paintbrush. "What are you doing here?" Chris smiled, stepping closer. "I told you I wanted to help, didn't I? Thought I'd come see what you're working on." Tony gestured to the banner. "We're trying to raise money for the center. Got a bake sale and car wash planned for the weekend." Peter chimed in. "It's slow going, but every little bit helps." Chris nodded, impressed by their initiative. "You three are something else, you know that? But I think we can speed things up a little." The boys exchanged curious glances. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked cautiously. Chris knelt to their level, his tone serious but kind. "I made a few calls. Some friends in construction, equipment suppliers, and a few local business owners. They're all on board to help fix this place up." The boys stared at him, their eyes wide with disbelief. "You're serious?" Tony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chris nodded completely. "This center is important to your community, and you three reminded me that helping others means more than anything money can buy. The repairs start next week." Ethan's face broke into a grin. "Did you hear that? He's going to fix the center." Peter jumped up, his excitement contagious. "This is amazing. The kids are going to love it." Tony, ever the practical one, frowned slightly. "But how much is all this going to cost, Mr. Chris? You don't have to spend so much just for us." Chris laughed, standing up. "Tony, this isn't just for you. It's for everyone who uses this place now and in the future. And trust me, it's worth every penny." The boys were buzzing with excitement, but Chris wasn't finished. Just then, a woman entered with a stack of papers and a tired smile. She paused when she saw Chris. "Hi," she said, her tone polite but wary. "I'm Karen, the director of the center. Can I help you?" Chris extended his hand. "I think I'm here to help you, Karen. The boys told me about the work you're doing here, and I'd like to pitch in." Karen's eyes widened. "Pitch in, how?" Chris gestured to the building. "I'm organizing a full renovation. New roof, updated playground, proper equipment for the kids. Whatever you need to make this place what it should be." Karen blinked, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Chris replied with a warm smile. "And let me know how I can make your job easier." Karen looked at the boys, then back at Chris. Her voice trembled with emotion.
"Yes.
Absolutely yes. Thank you." Over the next few hours, Chris worked alongside Karen and the boys to create a detailed plan. The renovations would begin immediately, starting with the roof and structural repairs. Chris took notes as Karen spoke passionately about the programs they wanted to offer but couldn't, due to the building's condition. The boys chimed in with ideas for the playground and activity areas, their energy infectious. When Chris finally left that evening, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the small town. He looked back at the community center, imagining what it would look like in a few months, a place that wasn't just functional, but thriving, filled with laughter and possibility. As he drove away, Chris felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a project. It was a chance to leave a lasting impact, to honor the selflessness of three boys who had reminded him of the importance of connection and kindness. He smiled, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. For the first time in years, Chris felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The renovations began swiftly, with teams of workers arriving at the community center the following week. Chris ensured that everything was planned down to the last detail. The old, leaky roof was replaced first, followed by repairs to the walls, plumbing, and electrical systems. It wasn't just a restoration, it was a complete transformation. Ethan, Tony, and Peter were there every day after school, watching in awe as the center changed before their eyes. They helped wherever they could, carrying tools, clearing debris, and even painting walls. The construction workers quickly grew fond of the boys, often joking with them and letting them take on small tasks under supervision. Chris made frequent visits to oversee the progress and chat with the workers, but his favorite moments were the breaks, sitting outside with the boys and Karen, discussing plans for the center's future. Each day, Chris felt a deeper connection to the community and the project. One bright Saturday morning, as the workers were finishing the final touches on the new playground, a crowd began to gather. Families from the town had heard about the renovations, and the excitement was palpable. The playground was a vibrant centerpiece, with colorful swings, a slide, and a jungle gym. It stood as a symbol of what was possible when people came together. Chris stood with Karen, watching as the last pieces of the playground equipment were bolted into place. Karen turned to him, her expression a mix of gratitude and amazement. "I don't think we'll ever be able to thank you enough," she said softly. Chris smiled, shaking his head. "Karen, this isn't about thanks. This place is going to mean so much to so many people. That's all I need." She nodded, but her eyes glistened. "You've done more than just fix a building, Chris. You've given this town hope." Before Chris could respond, Ethan, Tony, and Peter came running over, their faces alight with excitement. "It's done. The playground's done," Ethan exclaimed, pointing toward the workers who were stepping away from the newly installed equipment. Chris looked at the boys, their energy contagious. "You three should have the honor of testing it out first," he said, motioning toward the playground. Without hesitation, the boys sprinted toward the swings, laughing as they climbed aboard. Their carefree joy was infectious, drawing cheers from the gathered crowd. Parents watched with smiles, and children began lining up to join in. As the day turned into evening, Chris stood on the steps of the community center, gazing out at the bustling crowd. People mingled, children played, and laughter echoed through the air. Karen joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You've changed this place, Chris," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I think you've also changed yourself." He chuckled, taking a sip of the coffee. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Those boys, they reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Kindness doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it's as simple as stopping to help someone in need." Karen smiled. "And sometimes it grows into something much bigger." Later that evening, as the event wound down and families began to head home, Ethan, Tony, and Peter found Chris near his car. They stood quietly for a moment before Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Chris, we just wanted to say thanks. Not just for the center, but for everything," Ethan said, his voice earnest. Chris knelt to their level, looking each of them in the eye. "No, thank you. If it weren't for you three, I wouldn't have remembered what really matters." Tony shifted his hands in his pockets. We just thought we were helping with a flat tire." Chris laughed, reaching out to tousle Tony's hair. "You did more than that, Tony. You helped me fix something I didn't even realize was broken." Peter grinned, his eyes twinkling. "Well, if you ever need help again, you know where to find us." Chris stood, smiling warmly at the boys. "I think I'll take you up on that one day." The boys waved as they walked back toward their families, leaving Chris standing by his car. He watched them go, a profound sense of fulfillment settling over him. As Chris drove away that night, he didn't feel the emptiness that had once been his constant companion. Instead, he felt whole. The community center wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of what could happen when people came together, when they chose kindness over indifference. The story closes with a call to action. Join the movement for justice. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and make these stories a part of your daily life. Together, we can create real change.